March 6, 1945, 3:47 p.m., Cologne Cathedral Square, Germany. The gunner's periscope cracked like a spiderweb as Feldwebel Karl Hoffmann pushed his eye against it, trying to figure out the strange shape moving out of the ruined street. For 3 years, he had memorized every American tank silhouette. The tall Sherman with its weak 75mm gun. The little Stuart tanks Tiger crews laughed at and called toy panzers. Even the heavy jumbo Shermans with their extra armor, which still couldn't punch through a Tiger's front for more than 500 meters. But this was different. Das ist kein Sherman, he whispered into the intercom, his voice shaking in a way his crew had never heard before. That's not a Sherman. Through the cracked lens, he saw the new tank clearly. The gun barrel was massive, longer and thicker than any American tank gun he'd ever faced. The hull sat lower, sharper, with sloped armor that looked cast, not welded. And the turret, it was huge, almost too big for the hull, like someone had bolted an anti-aircraft gun onto a tank. His mind raced. Recognition charts. Training silhouettes. Intelligence briefings. Nothing matched. In exactly 18 seconds, Karl Hoffmann and his crew would be among the first German tankers to realize the Americans had finally built something that could destroy them, from any distance, from any angle. The Panther tank under Wilhelm Battlebohr of Panzer, Brigade 106, had already learned this lesson 3 minutes earlier. Its 5-man crew never lived to report what hit them. The M26 Pershing's 90mm M3 gun spoke first. The shell shot out at 853 meters per second, crossing the 120 meters between the tanks faster than Hoffmann could blink. It slammed into the Panther's front turret. The 100mm armor, which had stopped so many Sherman shells in France and Belgium, split open on impact. The 90mm round tore through the crew compartment with crushing force, then detonated. The math behind the Allied victory wasn't being written in fancy battle plans. It was written in production numbers and brutal battlefield encounters. These moments would crush every belief soldiers had about their enemies, their homeland, and their cause. For years, the legend of German tank superiority had been forged in steel and blood. It started when the first Tiger tank rolled into battle near Leningrad in August 1942. For 2.5 years, German heavy tank crews lived inside machines that seemed to break the basic rules of armored warfare. Their powerful 88mm guns could destroy any Allied tank from over 2,000 meters away. Their armor, 100mm thick on the front hull and 120mm on the turret, made them almost impossible to destroy with standard Allied guns at normal ranges. But the real power wasn't just in the steel, it was in the fear they inspired. Veterans of Schwer Panzerabteilung 506 described feeling almost untouchable inside their Tigers. And the numbers backed that up. The American M4 Sherman's 75mm gun could only pierce a Tiger's front armor at less than 100 meters, and only with special ammo and a perfect shot. Meanwhile, the Tiger's 88mm KWK-36 could blow through a Sherman's front from 2,000 meters. By late 1944, German tank crews had perfected tactics that took full advantage of this edge. They positioned their Tigers and King Tigers at long distances, using their superior guns and optics to knock out Allied tanks before they could even get close. One Tiger could, and often did, stop entire Allied attacks. The most famous example came at Villers-Bocage in June 1944. SS Obersturmführer Michael Wittmann's single Tiger destroyed 14 tanks, 2 anti-tank guns, and 13 other vehicles in under 15 minutes. Wittmann would die in August 1944, months before the Pershing tank appeared, but the psychological impact of the Tiger lived on. Allied crews developed what they called Tiger fever. Many thought they saw Tigers everywhere, reporting far more encounters than actually happened. Meanwhile, German heavy tank crews moved into each fight with a dangerous confidence that came from knowing their machines could dominate the battlefield. German heavy tank crews had developed an almost mystical belief in their invincibility. They painted kill rings on their gun barrels like fighter pilots did on their planes, proud symbols of every tank they had destroyed. But what they didn't know was that 8,000 kilometers away, inside the Detroit tank arsenal, American engineers had been quietly working since September 1942 on a secret project called T-26. Their goal, build something powerful enough to shatter the myth of German tank invulnerability. The road to creating the M26 Pershing started with a hard truth. American tank design had fallen dangerously behind. The M4 Sherman, the backbone of U.S. armored forces, was designed in 1941 when the most dangerous German tank was the Panzer IV with its short 75mm gun. But by the time Shermans faced Tigers in Italy and Normandy, they were outgunned and outmatched in armor, firepower, and effective range. The Pershing program became a massive crash project. 14 major contractors, 300 subcontractors, and over 50,000 workers across 22 states. The Fisher Body Division of General Motors, which had been building Shermans at its Grand Blanc arsenal in Michigan, was ordered to retool immediately for the new heavy tank. The changes were huge. New casting techniques for the turret, a completely different transmission system, and most importantly, the integration of a 90mm gun, a weapon that had only been used on tank destroyers and anti-aircraft guns until now. The 90mm M3 gun was a masterpiece of American engineering. Based on the powerful 90mm anti-aircraft gun, it fired a 24-pound armor-piercing shell at speeds of more than 2,800 feet per second. The standard M82 APC round could pierce 119mm of armor at 500 yards, enough to punch through a Tiger's front armor at real combat distances. The newer T-30E16 HVAP round, with its tungsten carbide core, could penetrate 221mm at the same range, enough to threaten even the King Tiger. The entire development program was wrapped in unprecedented secrecy. Workers at the Fisher Tank Arsenal were told they were just building an improved Sherman. To keep the new tank a secret, its components were built in different factories, so no single worker or plant knew the full design. When the first 20 Pershings were sent to Europe in January 1945, they weren't listed as tanks at all. They were labeled as heavy maintenance equipment and kept covered with tarps. Calendar January 15, 1945, New York port of embarkation. Late at night, under tight security, the first 20 M26 Pershings were carefully loaded onto ships headed for Europe. Each tank was wrapped in waterproof coverings and marked with false shipping codes. The crews chosen to operate them had been training in secret at Fort Knox since November. They were sworn to absolute silence. Breaking that oath meant a court-martial. The Atlantic crossing lasted 11 tense days through U-boat-infested waters. The Pershings were hidden deep inside the ship's hold, tucked behind rows of ordinary Shermans, so that even most of the ship's own crew didn't know they were there. During the voyage, the tank crews studied German armor identification charts and practiced their cover story. They were just replacement crews for Sherman units. January 26, 1945, Port of Antwerp. The Pershings arrived in Europe under cover of darkness. Special trains rushed them to the 3rd Armored Division's maintenance area near Düren, Germany, where crews made final preparations. Division Commander Major General Maurice Rose personally briefed battalion leaders on the new weapon. Calendar February 25, 1945. The first 4 Pershings were assigned to the 3rd Armored Division as part of the push toward the Rhine. 1 Pershing was placed in each task force, mixed in with regular Sherman units. Crews were ordered not to engage in combat unless they faced German heavy tanks. They painted the tanks in standard olive drab and added regular unit markings to make them blend in. But to trained eyes, the longer gun and lower silhouette made them stand out. German intelligence never saw it coming. Despite having one of the best spy networks of the war, the Wehrmacht had no idea the Pershing existed. German commanders believed the Americans would stick with mass-producing Shermans, assuming they couldn't build a heavy tank without slowing production. Calendar February 26, 1945, near Elsdorf, Germany. The Pershing saw its first combat loss. A T-26E3 nicknamed Fireball was ambushed at close range by a Tiger I. An 88mm shell slammed into its gun mantlet, killing the gunner and loader. But the tank wasn't lost for long. It was repaired and back in action by March 7th, showing the strength of American maintenance and logistics. Soon, German headquarters began receiving strange reports. Crews described facing an unidentified American tank with a much longer gun and heavier armor than the Sherman. A Panther crew claimed they were destroyed from 1,800 meters away by a single shot from this mysterious vehicle. The most chilling detail? Every single report mentioned that long gun, far bigger than the Sherman's standard 75mm. Calendar March 6, 1945. A storm was about to break over Cologne Cathedral Square. calendar 1945, Cologne, Germany. The battle at Cologne Cathedral would become the most famous tank duel of World War II, captured on film by Signal Corps cameraman Jim Bates. That morning, German forces positioned their last remaining tanks around the cathedral square. Wilhelm Bartelborth, commanding a Panther from Panzer Brigade 106, felt confident. The wide, open square gave him perfect fields of fire, and his tank sat behind piles of rubble that offered good hull cover. 3 o'clock 15:20 hours, Bartelborth spotted movement near the destroyed Gerien Hotel. Peering through his periscope, he saw what he thought was an unusual Sherman tank with a longer gun. He ordered his gunner to fire at 300 meters, point blank for the Panther's deadly 75mm gun. The Panther fired first. Its shell hit the front of the approaching tank. But instead of punching through, it bounced off in a shower of sparks. Bartelborth had just 3 seconds to realize something was very wrong. Inside the American M26 Pershing, nicknamed Eagle 7, Staff Sergeant Robert Early and his gunner, Corporal Clarence Smoyer, had already locked onto the Panther. Smoyer aimed at the mantlet and fired. The 90mm shell smashed through the Panther's turret face. Flames erupted as ammunition cooked off inside. Movie camera the film captured by Jim Bates shows what happened next. Another German tank nearby, accounts differ whether it was a Tiger or another Panther, tried to return fire. But Eagle 7 destroyed it too, with a single frontal shot. The entire engagement lasted less than 5 minutes, but it proved something huge. American tanks could now stand toe-to-toe with German armor. The destruction of those German tanks at Cologne Cathedral caused panic at the top of the German command. Oberkommando West issued urgent orders. All units were to report any encounters with the mysterious new American heavy tank. The reports they received were chilling. German crews described American tanks with long 90mm guns and heavy frontal armor, knocking out Panthers and Tigers from over 1,500 meters away. But the Germans didn't know this was a brand new tank. Crews started calling it the Long Gun Sherman, unable to imagine that the Americans had built a completely new heavy tank. This misunderstanding lasted for weeks. German crews used their usual anti-Sherman tactics and paid the price. The Panzerwaffe's training system was totally unprepared. Tank schools had no intel, no recognition charts, and no manuals for fighting this new threat. Doctrine still assumed American tank guns couldn't penetrate German heavy armor frontally. By mid-March 1945, about 20 Pershings were operational in Europe, with more arriving each week. That number was small compared to the thousands of Shermans, but its impact was enormous. The psychological shock of facing a tank that could match and even beat their best armor hit German crews hard, and it showed on the battlefield. The impact of the Pershing went far beyond numbers. German tank crews who were used to engaging Shermans without fear now approached every battle with hesitation. The kill ratios tell only part of the story. In the few encounters where Pershings fought German tanks, they achieved strong results. Statistically, 20 tanks wasn't a big enough sample to draw firm conclusions, but what truly mattered was the uncertainty they created. From a distance, German crews couldn't tell a Pershing apart from a Sherman. That meant in every engagement, they had to second-guess whether the tank in their sights might actually be a deadly new threat. The production numbers made the situation even worse for Germany. By early 1945, German factories could barely build 100 tanks per month. In contrast, American industry was operating at full power. By the end of the war, the U.S. had produced 2,222 Pershings, with the Fisher-Body Grand Blanc arsenal alone rolling out 1,739 units. When German crews learned about these production rates through captured documents or interrogations, the message was clear. They weren't just facing a technically superior tank, they were facing a nation that could replace losses faster than Germany ever could, even at its peak. The capture of damaged Pershing parts and the examination of knocked-out vehicles gave German engineers their first real look at American heavy tank technology, and what they saw shocked them. The cast turret was made from a single massive piece, something Germany had never developed for such large components. The Ford GAF V8 engine delivered 500 horsepower while staying reliable, something German engines often struggled with. The transmission had advanced features that seemed almost too complex to work, yet it ran smoothly. German technical officers quickly realized this wasn't just an upgrade. Every component represented a leap in engineering. The gun stabilization system allowed Pershings to fire accurately even while moving, something German Tigers couldn't do. The power traverse could spin the turret a full 360 degrees in just 15 seconds. And the optics were on par with German quality, long considered the best in the world. These discoveries hit German crews hard. The technical details weren't just specs on paper. They were proof that their advantage was gone. The Pershing wasn't just another American tank. It was a sign that the battlefield had changed. The inside of the Pershing was roomy compared to German tanks, with better ergonomics for the crew. Its ammunition storage used wet stowage, a system that reduced the risk of onboard fires, something German tanks badly needed but didn't have. Even small things like padded surfaces, interior lighting, and a more organized layout showed a level of attention to crew comfort and safety that German designs had long sacrificed for firepower and armor. Word about the American heavy tank's capabilities spread quickly through the Panzerwaffe. For tank crews already worn down by constant retreats and shortages, this news hit morale hard. Many of these men had fought on, believing their technical edge could make up for being outnumbered. Now that last advantage was gone. German tactical doctrine had always been built on superiority in technology to balance inferiority in numbers. Their defensive positions relied on Tigers and Panthers being able to destroy Shermans at long range while staying out of danger. Their offensive plans assumed German heavy tanks could smash through American lines with acceptable losses. But with the arrival of the Pershing, those assumptions collapsed. The psychological impact showed up in the battlefield reports. More and more German tanks were being abandoned for mechanical issues. Crews who once repaired broken tracks or engines under fire now walked away at the first sign of trouble. Recovery teams often found tanks left behind with minor problems. Loose tracks, thrown treads, or empty fuel tanks, the kind of issues crews would have fixed just weeks earlier. By late March 1945, as American forces pushed toward the Rhine, German tank crews were fighting in a new kind of war. They were ordered to hold bridgeheads against advancing Americans, but they no longer knew what they were facing. Every engagement was now a deadly gamble. Were those Shermans approaching, or Pershings? Across the front, the pattern was the same. German tanks that had once stood and fought were now withdrawing at the first sign of contact. The Pershing hadn't just changed the battlefield. It had broken the confidence that had carried German crews through years of war. Defensive positions that should have held for days collapsed within hours. The arrival of just 20 M26 Pershing tanks among thousands of American Shermans made little material difference on paper, but its psychological effect on the German armored forces was devastating. By April 1945, German armored resistance in the West had all but disintegrated. Units that still possessed operational Panther Tank S and Tiger IS often refused to engage American armor unless they could be assured no Pershings were present. Since no such certainty existed, many formations simply stopped launching offensive operations altogether. The battle for Dessau, from April 21st to 24th, demonstrated this new reality with brutal clarity. German defenders, despite fielding powerful Panthers and Tigers, remained in static defensive positions, deliberately avoiding armored duels. When the American forces attacked with Pershings mixed among regular Shermans, they encountered minimal organized resistance. German crews, once famed for their aggressive tactics, now prioritized withdrawal over combat with tanks they believed superior. Tank aces who had built legendary reputations over years of war abandoned their vehicles at the mere rumor of Pershings in the area. What had once been a force that conquered France and came close to defeating the Soviet Union had lost the will to fight. As the front collapsed in late April and early May 1945, thousands of German tank crews surrendered without resistance. Interrogations by U.S. Army intelligence revealed the true extent of this collapse. Veteran tankers consistently described learning about American heavy tanks as a psychological breaking point. For 3 years, they had relied on their technical superiority, believing their Tigers and Panthers could dominate any battlefield. When that belief was shattered, so too was their morale. Ironically, many of these crews admitted they had never actually encountered a Pershing in battle. But they didn't need to. The uncertainty alone, never knowing whether the approaching American armor was made up of Shermans or Pershings, was enough to paralyze decision-making and break their fighting spirit. The Pershing didn't just arrive on the battlefield. It changed the way the enemy thought, and in war, that can be even more powerful than firepower. What many German tank crews didn't fully grasp until after the war was the true scale of American heavy tank production. By the time Germany surrendered in 1945, only 310 M26 Pershing tanks had actually arrived in Europe. Barely 20 of them saw combat. On paper, that number seemed small. But behind the front lines, an industrial machine unlike anything Germany could match was already in motion. By October 1945, American factories had produced more than 2,200 Pershings. Fisher Body's Grand Blanc arsenal alone rolled out 1,739 tanks. The Detroit Tank Arsenal, operated by Chrysler, added another 473. Once the production lines were fully converted, an M26 could be completed in just a few hours, a staggering contrast to the weeks required to hand-build a Tiger I. Germany's entire wartime production had yielded only 1,347 Tiger I tanks and 492 Tiger II tanks. The numbers alone told a grim story. America wasn't just matching German technology, it could flood the battlefield with it. This industrial scale was something the German crews never truly experienced during the war. But when they learned about it during or after the final battles, the psychological impact was devastating. These weren't inexperienced tankers panicking under fire. These were battle-hardened veterans, men who had survived years of brutal combat and understood tank warfare intimately. They described their experience in two eras, before and after learning about the Pershing. Before, they believed in German technological superiority, the one advantage they felt could turn the tide of war, even as the Reich crumbled around them. After that faith vanished, their mindset shifted from seeking victory to merely surviving. This reaction was unlike their response to other Allied advantages. When faced with overwhelming numbers, they adjusted tactics. When confronted with Allied air supremacy, they moved at night and concealed their tanks. But when they realized the Americans had technological parity, or even superiority, in tank design, there was no tactical solution left. The one edge they had relied on since 1942 was gone. And with it, so was their will to fight. Nothing captured the psychological collapse of the German armored forces more vividly than the fate of Tiger II crews in the war's final weeks. The King Tiger was supposed to be the ultimate weapon, 68 tons of steel and firepower, its 150mm frontal armor and long-barreled 88mm gun making it almost untouchable from the front. For months, it had been a symbol of German invincibility on the battlefield. But by April 1945, that symbol had been hollowed out. King Tiger crews, once the elite of the Panzerwaffe, hesitated to fight. Not because their tanks had suddenly become weaker, but because the battlefield had changed. The arrival of M26 Pershing, with its powerful 90mm gun, shattered the psychological shield that had once protected them. They no longer knew whether the American tanks on the horizon were Shermans they could easily destroy, or Pershings that could kill them in return. And that uncertainty was deadly. Post-war investigations exposed a massive intelligence failure. German spy networks and signals units had completely missed the Pershing program. The Wehrmacht had no idea the Americans were developing a heavy tank until they began to face it on the battlefield. Even more devastating was their misjudgment of American industry. German analysts assumed mass production meant mediocrity. They never imagined the United States could build heavy tanks without sacrificing quantity. By April 1945, the consequences were everywhere. German armored units refused to attack. The mere rumor of Pershings in a sector could cause withdrawals, even when no Pershings were present at all. Tank commanders began abandoning their vehicles after the smallest mechanical failures. Reports of enemy heavy tanks poured in from sectors where, in reality, only Shermans operated. The Pershing didn't need to destroy hundreds of King Tigers to win. Its psychological shadow did the job. It wasn't just a tank, it was a symbol that the last German advantage had vanished. The King Tiger, once feared across Europe, became a fortress that its own crews no longer trusted. While the M26 Pershing struck fear into German armored units, it was far from perfect. Beneath its powerful image were very real flaws. The transmission was notoriously unreliable, causing frequent mechanical breakdowns. Its 90mm gun, while devastatingly powerful, had a slower rate of fire than the feared German 88mm. And its armor, though cleverly sloped, was thinner than that of the Tiger II. On paper, the Pershing wasn't a super tank. In fact, it was roughly equivalent to the Panther tank, better in some areas, worse in others. But war isn't fought on paper. Its power came not from raw numbers, but from shattering a belief that had sustained German tank crews for years. The belief in their own technological superiority. Only about 20 Pershings saw actual combat in Europe, far too few for meaningful statistics. Yet the psychological impact was enormous. German crews believed they were now facing a tank equal or superior to their own. And that belief changed everything. The effect was immediate and measurable. In the war's final weeks, German armored crews, who once would have fought to the last bolt, now chose to surrender rather than face possible Pershings. Facing Shermans meant a fight they believed they could win. Facing Pershings meant death. By late April 1945, U.S. Army intelligence noted something astonishing. German tank crews were surrendering before their infantry. A complete reversal of previous behavior. The shock was even more severe for elite units transferred from the Eastern Front. These crews, veterans of battles where they had dominated T-34-85 and IS-2 tanks, arrived in the West confident and undefeated. Units like Schwer Panzerabteilung 503 had destroyed hundreds of Soviet tanks. But after their first encounters with American heavy tanks, or even rumors of them, their effectiveness plummeted. The contrast was psychologically devastating. In the East, they were hunters. In the West, they suddenly feared becoming the hunted. This cognitive dissonance, the collapse of belief in German technical dominance, broke the will of some of the most experienced armored units in the world. The Pershing didn't need to win every battle. It only needed to convince German crews they could lose. The realization struck like a hammer blow. If the Americans had not only caught up to Soviet tank development, but surpassed it, while maintaining overwhelming numerical superiority, then the German armored force was facing something it had never truly confronted before, an unstoppable enemy. As word of the M26 Pershing spread through the Panzerwaffe, technical details trickled down from combat reports and intelligence briefings. Each new fact deepened the psychological wound. A stabilized gun that allowed accurate fire on the move. An advanced transmission smoother than anything German crews had used. Crew comfort features that German tanks had never prioritized. An infantry telephone mounted on the rear hull so soldiers could talk directly with the crew. Proof of a combined arms philosophy the Germans couldn't match. And wet ammunition storage, a feature that saved crews from catastrophic explosions. These weren't just technical upgrades. They were a statement. The Americans hadn't simply matched German engineering. They had out-engineered the engineers who believed themselves the best in the world. For crews raised on the certainty of German superiority, this was devastating. The final battles of April 1945 revealed how deeply this shock had sunk in. Where Tiger Eye crews had once stalked Shermans with predatory confidence, they now hesitated uncertain. German doctrine taught them to engage the most dangerous target first. But what if that Sherman was actually a Pershing? Identification took seconds they no longer had. Hesitation at the decisive moment often meant death. No matter which American tank was actually in front of them. Post-war historians would call it one of the most underrated psychological turning points of the Western Front. While the number of Pershings in combat was small, their impact on German morale was immense. The statistics tell the story. In the 2 months before Pershing deployment, German tank units in the West maintained relatively high operational readiness despite shortages. But after the first Pershing encounters, readiness plummeted. Not because of combat losses, but because crews abandoned their tanks. For years, German tank crews had fought believing their technology would compensate for dwindling numbers and a collapsing front. The arrival of the Pershing shattered that belief. And once that psychological foundation crumbled, so did their will to fight that in the decades after the war, German tank veterans would return to the same moment again and again. Not the loss of a single battle. Not the fall of Berlin. But the day they learned the Americans had built a tank that could match the Tiger. At reunions and in memoirs, the words echoed like a shared confession. Technological superiority was our last hope. And the Pershing destroyed it. The M26 Pershing wasn't just a tank. It was a psychological hammer blow. These men, who had spent years believing that their engineering was unmatched, now faced the truth. American factory workers in Detroit had built a machine that could stand toe-to-toe with their most feared armor. The realization cut deeper than any battlefield defeat. The industrial democracy they had been taught to despise had achieved technical parity, and done so while outproducing Germany on a scale the Reich could never dream of. What they didn't fully understand during the war would have crushed their morale completely. The Pershing was only the beginning. The T-26 E-4 Super Pershing, armed with an even more powerful 90mm gun, entered limited production with 25 units, one of which saw combat in Europe. The T-26 E-5 pushed frontal armor thickness to an astonishing 279mm. And behind those stood the T-29 with a 105mm gun and the T-30 with a massive 155mm gun. Prototypes of a future Germany would never get to fight. American tank design wasn't just catching up. It was accelerating past anything Germany could field. The numbers told the real story. By April 1945, U.S. tank production covered over 50 million square feet of factory space. The Detroit tank arsenal alone dwarfed much of German tank manufacturing capacity. Entire automobile plants at Fisher Body Division were retooled in a matter of months, a transformation German industry could never match. But beyond the tactical and technical realities lay something far more devastating, an ideological collapse. German crews had been told they were fighting for technological and racial superiority. The sight of a Pershing rolling toward them, built by the very people Nazi propaganda called inferior, shattered that illusion. This wasn't just the loss of a war. It was the death of a belief system. The psychological shock hit hardest among Waffen-SS tank crews. These men had been chosen not just for their skill, but for their ideological loyalty. They believed in the Nazi racial theories that justified everything they'd fought for. And then came the Pershing. The M26 Pershing didn't just challenge their battlefield tactics. It shattered the entire worldview that kept them fighting. If the Americans, the people Nazi propaganda called inferior, could build a better tank, what did that say about everything they'd been taught to believe? The true impact of the Pershing wasn't measured in kill counts. It was measured in fear, hesitation, and collapse. In total, 310 Pershings reached Europe before Germany's surrender. Only about 20 ever saw combat. Statistically, that's a small number. But psychologically, it was a tidal wave. German records tell the story clearly. Where Pershings were rumored to be, tank abandonments spiked. Crew surrenders increased sharply. Operational readiness in panzer units dropped across the board. Ironically, German engineers had developed advanced designs that might have outclassed the Pershing, the Panther II, E-50, and E-75. But they came too late, and in numbers far too small to matter. That contrast said everything. Germany chased technical perfection in individual weapons. America built good enough, in overwhelming numbers. When the Pershing finally matched German tanks in firepower and protection, while American factories kept producing at full speed, the German war effort became mathematically impossible to sustain. The shock of facing American heavy tanks left a scar on German military thinking that lasted long after the war. Post-war doctrine in the Bundeswehr was clear. Technological superiority alone could never again be assumed as a strategic advantage. The Pershing didn't just end a battlefield myth. It broke a belief system. The German military came to deeply respect America's industrial power, and that respect is still remembered today. After the war, many German veterans who moved to America said it was the sheer industrial strength they had seen, symbolized by the M26 Pershing, that influenced their decision. They realized that if America could build such advanced tanks while still protecting freedom and prosperity, then maybe the American way of life was worth believing in. Today, surviving Pershing tanks stand in museums around the world as quiet proof of that power. At the Patton Museum of Cavalry and Armor in Fort Knox, a Pershing sits next to a captured Tiger II. The sign there explains their technical similarities, but it can't capture the shock German crews felt when they first faced American heavy tanks. For them, the Pershing wasn't just a tank, it was a symbol of unstoppable American industry, showing that the U.S. could build machines just as good as Germany's, and in far greater numbers. The numbers tell the story clearly. 310 Pershings arrived in Europe before the end of the war. Only 20 actually fought in combat. A total of 2,212 Pershings were built by October 1945. Germany built 1,347 Tiger I and 492 King Tigers during the entire war. Fisher Body Grand Blanc Arsenal made 1,739 Pershings, and Chrysler Detroit Tank Arsenal added 473. Even though only a few Pershings fought, their psychological impact was huge. Once German crews realized the Americans could mass-produce heavy tanks, their confidence collapsed. It was as damaging as losing actual battles. The last tank fight between a German tank and a Pershing happened in April 1945, near the end of the war. By then, the psychological blow was complete. German crews who once believed they had the best technology ended the war realizing American industrial democracy had caught up, and even passed them. This moment left lasting lessons. Winning a war isn't just about who has the better machine. It's about having the industrial strength to build and sustain those machines. And it's about the psychological effect that strength has on the enemy. In just 8 weeks, from the Pershing's first combat in February to Germany's surrender in May, the Germans went from feeling like hunters to feeling hunted. 20 tanks didn't just fight battles, they shattered a myth. The M26 Pershing didn't win its greatest victory by blowing up German tanks. Only about 20 of them ever saw combat. You can't even run a meaningful statistical analysis with numbers that small. Its true victory was in destroying German certainty. For years, German tank crews had kept fighting even when outnumbered, believing their technology would always give them the edge. But when they saw American heavy tanks appear on the battlefield, that belief collapsed. The Pershing did what thousands of M4 Sherman tanks couldn't do. It didn't crush the enemy with sheer numbers or clever maneuvers. It shattered their confidence. When German crews looked through their periscopes and saw that long American 90mm gun aimed at them, they weren't just seeing a weapon. They were seeing the end of an era. Most German crews didn't even know the Pershing carried a 90mm gun capable of killing their Tigers until it opened fire in real battles. When those shots rang out, the myth of German invincibility died on the spot. The hunters had become the hunted, and they knew it. That realization triggered a psychological collapse that helped bring the war in Europe to its end. The Pershing became a symbol of a hard truth in warfare. Technological superiority is temporary, but industrial power and democratic innovation endure. German tankers learned this in the harshest way possible. While staring down the barrel of a 90mm American gun that proved democracy could build weapons every bit as deadly as those made under totalitarian rule. The impact of those few Pershings went far beyond statistics. Their psychological power was enough to help break the spirit of one of the most feared armored forces in history.